The moment we touched down on Garen 4, I knew it was nothing like the barren, dead rocks I'd spent my career studying. Even with only a trace atmosphere and an empty horizon stretching to infinity, the moon had a peculiar density to its silence. Something thick, charged and expectant. Our shuttle hummed its way into the mineral-rich soil, breaking the stillness of the landscape. I was at the edge of my seat, watching the scanners light up in rapid blips, each signal bearing promise of the mineral deposits we had come to catalogue and retrieve. This was more than a job. This was humanity's answer to the energy crisis. I was the first to step out. Dr. Julian Kessler, molecular biologist, 40, and maybe a bit too old for interstellar exploration. But I'd been hand-picked for this, for my skill in cellular studies. Behind me, the rest of the crew emerged. Stokes, our security specialist, took up a defensive position with his usual military precision, scanning the rocky horizon with a frown. Fields, our resident geologist, already had his scanners out, his eyes lit up with the excitement of discovery. And finally, Commander Adam Monroe, mission leader, led Dr. Jared Neal, our medical officer, down the ramp. Monroe was all about protocol, his hands resting on his utility belt like a soldier ready to draw. After ensuring our suits and gear were secure, we advanced, each of us carrying our own set of equipment, and headed toward the point of interest on our scanners. A massive depression several hundred yards away. It looked like a crater from above, but as we approached, it became clear it was no simple impact site. The earth around it was cracked and split, with thin strands of an unusual mineral formation stretching across the rough edges like veins. "Looks geological," Fields muttered, kneeling down to analyze a section of the strands. "Possibly an old tectonic fracture. High mineral content. This is incredible. We're talking off-the-charts concentrations here." Commander Monroe glanced at me, his visor reflecting my own curiosity. "Kessler, any thoughts?" I crouched down, brushing my gloved fingers along the strands. They felt oddly soft for rock, almost pliant, but held a rigidity that reminded me of bone or coral. "It's strange, but it doesn't look like any mineral formation I've seen before. It's almost organic." Stokes grunted, his voice crackling through our comms. "Hope it's just rocks. Organic's not in my job description." We shared a brief chuckle, tension easing just a little, and then moved toward the crater's center, where the largest outcropping rested. The formation was taller than we were, branching out in arching, bone-white spires and plunging downwards like roots of an ancient tree burrowing into the ground. As we approached, a soft tremor ran through the soil, vibrating up our legs. "Did you feel that?" Neil asked, his voice wavering. He glanced down at his scanner, frowning at the results. "It's like it's alive. There's a pulse to it." "It's probably just residual seismic activity," Monroe said, but even he didn't sound convinced. Fields took a sample from one of the roots, pulling back quickly as the rock-like surface cracked and wept a thin, viscous liquid. It glistened in his sample vial, like mercury mixed with something organic and cellular. "This shouldn't be possible," Fields whispered, watching the liquid settle. "It's mineral, but it's bleeding?" The others exchanged uneasy glances, but I couldn't shake the thrill in my gut. Here was something unknown, something that couldn't be rationalized. I focused on the pattern of the structure. Its formations were too precise, almost symmetrical, branching out in a pattern that felt more biological than geological. "Let's document everything and take samples. This could be some sort of biomineral hybrid, a new type of life form or structure. Either way, it's worth studying." We spent the next few hours documenting and gathering samples. The deeper we ventured into the structure, the more I became aware of an odd sensation, a change in the air around us, something that shouldn't have been possible given our sealed suits. I caught myself inhaling with a slight effort, each breath feeling dense, almost stifling, like the air had thickened with something I could almost taste. It struck me suddenly. I could smell it. A sharp, mineral tang, almost acrid, seemed to cling to me, creeping into my helmet and filling my nose as if I were breathing it directly. But that wasn't possible. Our suits were hermetically sealed, filtering out any trace of the environment outside. There should have been no scent at all. I glanced at the others, wondering if they'd noticed it too, or if I was simply imagining things. But from the way Fields kept shaking his head, muttering as if trying to clear his thoughts, and Stokes' uneasy glances at the life support control panel on his suit, I realized they were feeling it too. The air, somehow, felt heavy, saturating each breath even though we were entirely sealed off from the atmosphere of Garen 4. It was then that I first noticed the odd prickle on my skin. I ignored it at first, brushing it off as some odd sensation from the layers of my suit. But the tingling persisted, intensifying whenever I touched the structure. As I continued collecting samples, I noticed a faint red mark on the back of my hand, just under the transparent layer of my glove, a tiny, root-like growth resembling a scar stretching across my skin. "Neil, can you take a look at this?" I called over. He approached, adjusting his visor to focus on my hand. "It's a rash," he said, his voice unsure. Though I've never seen a rash form like that before. Almost looks like the veins are branching out. He checked his scanner, then pulled back. "You're not the only one, Kessler. Stokes has got the same thing, and so does Monroe." He hesitated, glancing at his own hand with a frown. "Could it be something in the atmosphere?" We all paused, letting his words hang in the air. It didn't make sense. Our suits were fully sealed, completely cut off from the environment outside. The idea that anything from the atmosphere could be affecting us was impossible. Stokes, overhearing, let out a skeptical laugh. "It's this damn place," he muttered. "Maybe there's some alien spore or mineral that's getting through, but that's not possible, right?" The silence that followed was thick, each of us trapped in the same uneasy thought. Sealed as we were, nothing should be capable of bypassing our suits. Yet here we were, each with these marks, these changes appearing beneath layers of supposedly impenetrable protection. We returned to the shuttle, our makeshift base on this moon, and began cataloguing the samples we'd gathered. Inside the shuttle's small lab, we ran preliminary tests, observing results that challenged our understanding. The samples from the bioorganic structure displayed an eerie complexity, something entirely unexpected for what should have been a mineral formation. Each sample seemed to contain cells that mimicked mineral properties, a bizarre fusion I'd never seen in all my years of study. My fascination quickly bordered on obsession as I pored over the data, analyzing every reading and rechecking results, driven to find some logical explanation. I was so absorbed I barely noticed Commander Monroe approach. "Pack it up, Kessler," he ordered, his tone edged with tension. "We need to re-establish communication with HQ and report these findings as soon as possible." I nodded, reluctantly stepping away from the samples. But as I lifted my hand to close the case, a sudden sharp, prickling sensation spread across my fingers. I pulled my hand back, staring at it in horror. My fingertips appeared translucent, the flesh thinning as though fading. The branching pattern on my skin had grown, thin lines now extending down along my wrist. Neil was the first to notice, his eyes widening. "Kessler, how long has that been there?" I shook my head, clenching my hand and hiding it. "Not long. I'll get it checked out." I felt the others watching me, a tension mounting in the confined space as we suited up to head back outside and try boosting our communication signal. Back on the moon's surface, the cold was biting, an unnatural chill that cut through even the insulation of our suits. As we approached a clear area to set up the transmitter, Stokes stumbled, clutching his wrist with a grimace. "Damn it, my arm. It feels like something's moving in there," he muttered, flexing his hand in discomfort. "What do you mean, moving?" Monroe asked sharply, his gaze shifting to Stokes with concern. "It's nothing," Stokes snapped, though his expression betrayed his discomfort. "Let's just finish up and get back to the shuttle." Silence fell over us as we worked, each of us retreating into our own uneasy thoughts. Finally, with the equipment set, we returned to the shuttle. Back inside, I checked my hand again, only to find the branching pattern had spread further, darkening and tracing delicate lines up my arm. Under the artificial light, my fingers looked almost skeletal, their outlines slightly distorted. That night, as I lay in my bunk staring at the dimmed ceiling, the sensation intensified. My body felt foreign, the skin stretched and prickling, as though something alive was trying to push its way out. I glanced over at the others. Stokes was twisting restlessly in his sleep, his face contorted in discomfort, scratching his arm where the same branching lines had appeared on his skin. The next morning I found Fields in the lab, staring at his arm with an expression somewhere between awe and horror. He held up his arm, showing me. The branching pattern had spread up his wrist and along his forearm, darker and more pronounced than mine. My mind raced, grasping for explanations, but nothing in my knowledge could account for this. It shouldn't have been possible. And yet, there it was. A silent invasion taking hold of each of us in ways none of us could understand. By midday, Neil approached me, showing me the branching lines covering his hands. His fingertips were bruised, almost purple. We gathered in the shuttle's small lab, each of us examining the spreading patterns. It was clear now that this was no ordinary reaction. The structure we had touched, it was somehow doing this to us, infiltrating our bodies despite the barriers we'd relied on. "This can't be happening," I whispered, panic choking me. Monroe looked at each of us, his face set, eyes hard. "This isn't some simple exposure. We've come into contact with something unknown, and it's affecting us in ways we don't understand. We're going to document everything, and then we're getting off this moon. Understood?" We nodded, though my mind was already spiraling, consumed by thoughts of the alien structure, of how it had reacted to us. I could feel its presence even now. The changes were real, physical, and intensifying by the hour. The branching lines on my skin haunted my every move, etched into my flesh like a signature from something alien. I could sense the same terror and confusion gripping the others. Neil's bruised fingertips, Stokes's muttered curses as he scratched at the lines winding their way up his arm, Fields's incessant scanning of his own skin. All of us were wrapped in the same inescapable unease. We needed answers, something concrete to bring back to HQ, a chance to understand what was happening to us. Finally, Monroe made the call. We would return to the structure. The samples we had taken felt insufficient, even irrelevant, in light of what was now happening. Whatever was affecting us was beyond anything we'd prepared for, and if there were any hope of stopping the changes, we'd have to find it there. As we approached the formation, we stopped dead in our tracks. The place we had left was unrecognizable. The alien structure had grown. The branching root-like formations had expanded, arching into the sky and spiraling down into the ground as if they were burrowing into the moon itself. Slender branches extended from these roots, glowing softly, wrapping around rock and soil alike, seeming to consume the terrain. "What in God's name?" Stokes's voice trailed off, his hand instinctively reaching toward his gun. "This wasn't here before. How is this possible?" Fields muttered, eyes wide as he took in the scene. Neil moved a few paces forward, his gaze transfixed by the massive organic structure towering above us. "It's alive," he said quietly, almost reverently. "We've triggered something. Some kind of response. Look at it. This growth, it's exponential." Monroe took a deep breath. "Let's proceed cautiously. We document everything and take fresh samples. This could be our only chance to get out of here with something that'll help us." Each step closer felt like pushing through an invisible barrier. I could feel the air change again, denser, charged with that strange taste that seemed to seep through our sealed suits. The sensation settled into my lungs, thickening each breath. My skin tingled beneath the suit, an unnerving sensation that seemed to creep up my arm in slow waves. The sensation was almost like a crawling itch just below my skin, spreading, branching as if something were winding its way through my veins. We reached the base of the structure, its branches sprawling across the ground, and stretching down into a cavernous opening. Inside, patches of light spread across the walls, casting an eerie green hue and revealing thick, fibrous masses that spiraled downward, deeper into the moon's depths. I exchanged a glance with Monroe. We both knew this was no longer just a cave. This was a system, something integrated, alive. "We go down," Monroe said, voice firm. "If there's an answer, it's further in." The descent was steep, winding, each footfall echoing in the silence. The structure's growth continued all around us, forming walls and arches with thick, vine-like appendages stretching from floor to ceiling, narrowing as they receded into darkness. The further we went, the more the walls seemed to close in, transforming the cavern into something like the inside of a vast, organic body. At one point, Neil reached out to touch a patch on the wall, mesmerized. The surface under his fingers looked spongy, but as he pressed his gloved hand into it, the wall pulled back slightly, almost as if recoiling from his touch. He jerked his hand away. "This isn't rock or mineral, it's tissue," Neil whispered. "Some kind of organic, hybrid tissue." "What could even produce something like this?" I asked, studying the fibrous structure branching through the walls, laced with fine, dark veins that pulsed slowly. Stokes's eyes darted nervously across the walls, his fingers twitching toward his weapon. "Let's just get the samples and go." Deeper still, the pulsations in the walls became more intense, almost rhythmic, as if we were nearing some central organ or heartbeat. Every inch of the structure seemed reactive, aware of our presence. We paused at a point where the tunnel split into multiple winding paths, each choked with thick root-like structures, snaking through the moon's crust, wrapping themselves around rocks as if consuming them. "Which way?" I asked, my voice feeling thin, dwarfed by the massive organic walls around us. Monroe checked his scanner, shaking his head. "These readings, they're all over the place. Let's keep to the left path and see if it leads us somewhere more open." The passage narrowed as we proceeded, forcing us to duck under low, hanging growths that seemed to twitch. I was transfixed by one, noticing how its texture closely matched the pattern now spreading on my own arm. Each of us became more silent as we moved, the reality of our situation sinking in deeper with every step. This thing, it was a system, a network, consuming the terrain and transforming it. The tunnel opened into a vast space, its walls covered with thick, translucent sacs, each filled with a sluggish liquid. Inside, some of the sacs were vague, amorphous shapes, each suspended, almost embryonic. I stepped closer, peering into one of the sacs. The form within was shifting, undulating, as though trying to take shape. I could almost make out limbs, a torso, a humanoid form, yet incomplete, suspended in a grotesque mimicry of life. A sick realization washed over me. These were not mineral deposits or alien materials. They were organisms in gestation, incubating in the walls of this entity. Neil seemed to come to the same conclusion, his face blanched, his voice a whisper. "It's growing. It's growing copies of us." Fields let out a low, pained groan, clutching his arm through the thick material of his suit. His body shuddered, and he staggered back, his eyes clouded and distant, as though caught between pain and fascination. "It's spreading," he whispered, his voice strained. "I can feel it, burrowing deeper, like it's in sync with this place." His words sent a chill through me, the realization sinking in that whatever was happening to our bodies was somehow attuned to the alien structure surrounding us. As we moved through the tunnels, each of us began collecting samples from the walls, the sacs, and the growths that surrounded us. We extracted samples from the translucent sacs, each filled with a strange fluid and suspending embryonic forms. We also scraped fibers from the organic walls and collected sections of the thick, root-like veins. Each sample felt alien and yet disturbingly familiar, as though pieces of ourselves were entangled with them. As I was sealing my collection vial, I heard Fields mutter something under his breath. I glanced over to see him staring at one of the larger sacs, his face transfixed. His hand was shaking as he reached out, fingers stretching toward the membrane of the sac as if he were in a trance. "Fields?" I called, but he didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the form shifting within the sac. A shiver ran down my spine as I watched his hand get closer to the sac's membrane. The closer he got, the more his body seemed to slacken, his breathing shallow and irregular. His lips moved, but no words came out, and his expression was distant, as though he were lost in some invisible tether to the alien growth. Stokes grabbed Fields, his voice rough with alarm. "Snap out of it, Fields! We need to stay focused!" But Fields barely reacted. His eyes fixed on the walls as if seeing something we couldn't. His breathing became shallow, his body swaying slightly, as though tethered to an invisible thread binding him to the alien organism around us. "Fields," I said, moving closer, trying to snap him out of it. "What are you seeing?" He didn't answer, only reached out toward one of the sacks. "It's showing me. It's memories, it's ancient, and it's waiting to finish." His voice was distant, reverent, as if he were caught in a waking dream. I grabbed his shoulders, pulling him back. "No. Whatever this is, it's trying to take control. We've gathered the samples. Let's get back to the shuttle." As we turned to retrace our steps, I felt the tunnel tighten, the walls drawing towards us. The way back was blocked by thick growths, slowly sealing off our exit. A creeping dread settled over us as we realized the structure was preventing our escape. Stokes raised his weapon, aiming at the thickest part of the growth. "We're getting out, even if I have to blast our way through." He fired, and the tumors jerked, recoiling as if in pain, but only briefly. Seconds later, they reformed, filling in the gap, thicker and more impenetrable than before. "We're not getting out this way, it's forcing us deeper," I said. Monroe looked around, his face grim. "Then we go deeper and find another way out. Everyone stay close and keep your eyes on each other." We pressed onward, each step dragging us further into the heart of this place. The sacks hanging from the walls became more frequent, each containing vaguely human forms, almost as if it were trying to replicate us, to absorb our identities into itself. Neil stumbled, his breathing shallow. He looked back at us, his eyes filled with terror. "It's changing us from the inside. It's using us as part of its own structure." I felt the truth of his words sink into me. We weren't just dealing with an alien organism. We were inside it, and it was changing us, integrating us. Every line spreading across our skin, every alien thought creeping into our minds was a step in its process. We were becoming one with it. As we stood there, trapped within the corridors of this entity, it hit me. We weren't leaving Garen 4. The entity had us now, and it wasn't letting go. We were no longer explorers. We were becoming the next phase of its life. The walls rippled around us, closing in, as if the entire structure were inhaling. Every inch of the space seemed to respond to our presence, like a living organism flexing, tightening. We were deep inside it now, with no sense of direction left. Just the press of organic walls, tightening corridors, and the sickening knowledge that it was awake. We huddled close, scanning the surroundings, tension thick between us. Monroe moved ahead, trying to find a way forward, but there was no way out. Only walls throbbing with each beat, becoming thicker, more vibrant. One of the walls beside Stokes shifted, bulging outward with organic limbs that snaked out like roots searching for soil. They lashed around his arms and legs, pulling tight, jerking him backward before any of us could react. He cried out, his voice muffled by the mass that was already encasing his helmet. His arms trapped at his sides as the limbs twisted around him, yanking him against the wall with such force that we heard the crunch of bones under the pressure. Monroe jumped forward, grabbing his arm and pulling with all his strength. Neil and I joined in, trying to tear him free, but it was like wrestling with something immeasurably strong and unyielding. The wall itself seemed to absorb him, the flesh-like surface rippling and pulling him deeper, inch by inch. "No, no!" Stokes' voice was faint, muffled as the limbs wrapped around his faceplate, pressing him into the organic wall. His limbs disappeared first, his head the last thing visible, his terrified eyes wide, staring at us. Then, with a final, horrified gasp, he was gone, swallowed whole, the wall sealing behind him like he had never been there at all. For a long, awful moment we stood frozen, paralyzed by what we had just witnessed. But before we could process what had happened, a sound, wet and visceral, filled the space. We turned toward the source of the noise, our eyes drawn to one of the grotesque, translucent sacks hanging from the wall. The shape inside was moving, shifting. Yellowish fluid dripped down the sack's surface, the vague figure within becoming clearer, taking form, as if moulding itself into something recognizable. With a sickening rip, the membrane ruptured, and something fell out, slumping onto the floor in a slithering, wet heap. It took us a few seconds to realize what we were seeing. A twisted, malformed replica of Stokes, hunched over, its body raw and glistening, as if stripped of skin. Muscles and sinew lay exposed, a grotesque parody of human. It rose to its feet with jerking, awkward movements, its face bearing just enough resemblance to Stokes that it froze me in place. It turned its head toward us, eyes blank and searching, before letting out a distorted cry that echoed through the air. "Run!" Monroe shouted, but the command barely registered. My mind was locked on the thing that had once been Stokes, now lurching toward us, a predator born of the walls. We scattered, moving as fast as we could through the twisting corridors, but it was right behind us, a horrible echo of our friend, chasing us through the endless maze of organic tunnels. I could hear it snarling, hissing, each sound more twisted than the last. The walls were shifting now, and as we ran, more limbs reached out, coiling and waiting, the entity alive with hunger. We were losing ground, the sounds of pursuit closing in when another scream pierced the air. I spun around in time to see Neil struggling, organic limbs wrapping around his body and dragging him backward into the wall. He kicked and fought, his hands scrabbling for purchase, but the wall seemed to absorb him like wet clay, pulling him into its surface. Monroe grabbed his shoulders, but Neil's arms slipped free, sinking into the wall up to his elbow as he cried out in terror. "Please, don't let go!" Neil screamed, his free hand clawing at Monroe's sleeve, eyes wild with fear. Monroe held on, straining, but with a brutal yank, the wall surged forward, enveloping Neil entirely. Monroe was left holding only empty air as Neil's face vanished into the organic surface, a final desperate gasp escaping his lips before he was completely consumed. Then the wet tearing sound again. Another sac ruptured, spilling thick yellow fluid onto the ground as a second figure dropped out, twisted and twitching. It bore the semblance of Neil, his face grotesquely contorted, eyes wide and vacant. It stood, lurching and unsteady, then turned, blank and predatory, to hunt. Monroe's face was ashen, horror tightening his features. "It's copying them," he whispered, "making them into something else." Fields stumbled back, shaking his head. We need to find a way out. Now." We ran, but the corridor twisted and shifted with each step. The walls closed in, forcing us to duck and squeeze through tight spaces as we tried to escape. Every so often I'd catch sight of one of the amalgamations lurching after us, eyes blank yet focused, tireless in their pursuit. Fields was next. As he lagged behind, exhausted and stumbling, the wall beside him expanded, a mass of limbs grabbing him, yanking him into the surface. He struggled, screaming, his fingers clawing at the air, reaching for us as we tried to pull him free, but he was sucked in, disappearing inch by inch until his panicked eyes were all that was left. His gaze meeting mine in one last, horrified plea before the wall swallowed him whole. And then, from a sack above us, the tearing, sickening sound echoed again, a third figure falling, twitching to life, wearing Fields' face. "Go!" Monroe grabbed my arm, hauling me forward. "Don't look back." But it didn't matter. I could feel them, close behind us, the twisted parodies of our friends, their empty eyes focused on us with a single-minded intent. They moved faster than before, adapting with each new copy, driven to chase us through this living labyrinth. It was just Monroe and me now, stumbling through a winding claustrophobic tunnel with nowhere to go but forward. The walls vibrated, tightening around us, and I could feel the pulsing rhythm all around, as if the entire structure were alive with anticipation. Monroe pulled me down another narrowing passage, panting, eyes wild. We have to try and find some kind of central point, maybe disrupt this thing somehow," he muttered, half to himself. But before we could go further, the wall beside him surged out, grabbing him in a brutal coil. He struggled, his arms pinned at his sides, his face twisted in desperation as he looked at me. "Kessler, don't let it take me!" he gasped, thrashing, his voice strangled with panic. I grabbed his arm, pulling with all my strength, but the wall tightened its grip, drawing him in with ruthless force. His face twisted in agony as the limbs wrapped around his helmet, pulling him deeper inch by inch until he was lost to the wall. The sound of the sack rupturing behind me tore through the silence. I didn't dare look back, stumbling forward alone now, every instinct screaming at me to keep moving. But I could hear them. 4 twisted figures, each an imitation of a friend I'd lost, each of them hunting me, tracking me through this nightmarish maze. I forced myself forward, lungs burning, body numb, the walls closing in tighter with every step. Finally, I hit a dead end. The wall stood in front of me, organic, alive. I turned, back pressed against it, my breath shallow as the 4 figures advanced. They moved slowly, each step in sync, their eyes fixed on me with an insatiable hunger. There was no humanity in their eyes, only the will of the entity that had consumed them. They closed in, and I felt a horrible pressure against my back, the wall pressing forward, limbs reaching out, wrapping around my arms, my legs, pulling me in. I struggled, thrashing, but the force was overwhelming, an impossible strength drawing me closer, binding me. The 4 figures grabbed my arms and shoulders, their faces twisted reflections of my lost crew, each of them pressing me backward, their touch inescapable, inevitable. The wall behind me parted, pulling at me, wrapping around my torso, snaking up my neck. I felt my breath catch, my sight dimming as I was taken by the living wall. I could feel it now inside me, my skin stretching, warping, the branching lines burning through every inch of my flesh, binding me to the structure. I was losing myself, my mind fraying, my last thoughts slipping as the wall closed around me. The last thing I saw were their faces, twisted and blank, watching as I was absorbed, one final part of this entity's endless, insatiable design. What we failed to understand was that some mysteries do not wait to be solved. They wait to consume, patient and silent, until we bring ourselves willingly into their grasp.